Hello there and welcome to Digital Foundry Direct Weekly, number 206, which remains our weekly show where we discuss the latest gaming and technology news. And up to yesterday, not much news, but there's certainly a deluge of it now. Joining me to discuss it, first of all, Alex Battaglia. Hello.
Yes, there's quite a lot going on this week. Assassin's Creed came out, DXR updates. Who would have thought that would have happened, right?
Wow. A lot going on GDC week, but yeah, that's pretty much the extent of the news thus far. But also joining me to discuss that and other stuff, Oliver Mackenzie.
Yes, Rich, I think we were scrambling yesterday to dig some material up to talk about, but I think in the fullness of time, we've assembled a pretty good show for today.
Absolutely. But before we go on, as always, please do consider visiting store.digitalfoundry.net, the home of our merchandising wares. But with that, let's move on to our first news topic of the week. Okay, so I'm not quite sure how this one happened. It's the sort of quote-unquote mistake / error / leak that you wouldn't expect from a gigantic company like Microsoft. But yesterday, The Verge reported that, essentially Microsoft had leaked its own front-end update showing that you would have the ability to access Steam games within the Xbox user interface. And this was quickly withdrawn and replaced with a user interface that did not show Steam games being accessible on the Xbox user interface. But basically, it just seems to be further fuel to the fire, which suggests that there's going to be a grand unification of digital storefronts within the Xbox, I wouldn't say ecosystem, but basically their front-end shell for PC. And Alex, what do you make of this?
Well, this is good in the aspect that you'll be able to kind of like GOG, like their Galaxy launcher, I believe you can. Or what is they call? I forget what they call it, but you can kind of like launch multiple storefronts games from within one. It's kind of like adding a non-Steam game to Steam, but it's a lot better. This is I think the only way forward Microsoft really has. A lot of people will have built up libraries like myself ever since the beginning of Steam, and if you want to use either you're going to be using the Steam Big Picture mode like Oliver talked about last week, or you're going to want to do something native within Windows under this new project. And I think this is pretty much the only way they're going to be able to make this realizable in the immediate short term. One thing I'm curious about, though, is how much info can be plugged out of that other than just like the equivalent of an exe shortcut. Right. Because one thing you'd want to know is whether or not a game is being patched, maybe. You would maybe want to know its download status from this menu. You'd kind of want to know the same information about a game and managing it like you would in a typical Steam menu or in a typical Xbox menu, right? And I'm curious to see how much interoperability there actually potentially could be.
Yeah. Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly a very welcome change. I think, like Alex said, it's kind of necessary because Steam is such a huge storefront, right? Obviously very important for the kind of end-to-end integrated experience that you would expect that Xbox would eventually have, whether it's through the Xbox app or through changes to the operating system. Probably the latter, but I presume it would have some integration with the Xbox app as well. But I mean, there are so many issues with the Xbox app from my perspective for navigating it with a controller and for using it on the go. In particular, it's basically not really accessible through a controller. Like you punch around on the D-pad and you can make selections, but you can't actually switch tabs in the interface. You can't really do too much with the controller. There's very, very limited integration there. So I think they have a lot of area to go to improve this. I don't know whether they'll do it all at once or whether they'll roll it out gradually. Certainly this would seem to suggest a bit more of the latter approach. But I would hope that, yeah, in the fullness of time, they end up with a solution here that does work out pretty well for controller players and pretty well for people who have big Steam libraries, because that's obviously a really critical aspect of this whole effort, I think.
Yeah. My thoughts on this, well, I think you're quite right, Alex, in that you've got to basically either be all in on this or it is essentially just a fairly low-tech launcher, right? I mean, the concept of being able to access Xbox games and Steam games within a single unified launcher. It's actually nothing new. I don't think, there are solutions right now. In fact, basically all the handhelds already ship with their own rudimentary launchers that allow you to have, what you might call a one-stop shop to all of the different titles that are installed on your PC. The issue is, of course, that it is rudimentary. What's happening with game updates, what's happening with patch updates, all of the information that Steam offers. What about beta branches, that sort of thing? I honestly think that if you're going to be integrating other stores, you can't just have a basic launcher. It's got to be more than that. Otherwise, you're going to end up going back to the same old problem, which is that, okay, right, I've still got to access Windows 11 to basically get the full range of functionality. And that's problematic, I think. I think, if you're going to be advertising a system that does everything, it's got to kind of do everything. It's got to be able to access those features, and it's going to be tricky, and it may require some sort of hookup with Valve or with Epic or whoever to make it everything it needs to be. Now, obviously, looking at this mock-up image, and it does seem to be a mock-up image as opposed to anything sort of final and official. Mm-hmm. I mean, it is basically there with Xbox consoles. It's there with a ROG Ally. It's there with mobile devices. So I'm not quite sure how all that's going to pan out with Steam. So I think in that respect, it probably is early doors. Obviously, with the handheld, this Project Canon that's apparently coming this year, you'd want this sort of functionality, even at a basic level. However, once they're going into next generation, where apparently there is going to be access to other storefronts, I guess my question is, how far will they push it? The concept of buying an Xbox console, having Steam on it, and potentially buying Steam games. Are they going to go that far? That's the thing. How much are they willing to cede the walled garden, so to speak? The concept of the PC, of course, is that it's an open platform, right? And the idea that Microsoft is kind of making, or potentially making, a version of that open platform that's only as open as they kind of feel comfortable making it. Tricky. Mm-hmm. Really, really interesting to see that. Well, I'd love to know the production process that enabled this leak to happen. It is kind of baffling. Any extra thoughts on this, Alex? I mean, I think basically all bets are off when it comes to next generation. I mean, with the handheld that's coming, which is presumably kind of like more PC than Xbox, so to speak, the idea of having easy access to other storefronts isn't actually that much of a big deal, and it's kind of welcome and it's kind of necessary. But the question is really, when they move on to those next generation consoles, how much are they going to cede to the open platform, and how much are they going to continue to be protective over the Xbox store?
I think they're going to have to cede it a lot more than they would potentially have liked in a more ideal situation, because they, in comparison to Sony, are just floundering on the console sales side of things. And then, they're down over what Xbox One was doing in a similar period. With two boxes, right? So a potentially larger audience because the price brackets are different. And they're still not hitting the numbers that they did previously in time. And I think that shows a lot that the current model of things doesn't have the market for them anymore there, and they have to branch out to new markets. And the only way we really can do that is entice people with entirely new feature sets that just you won't get anywhere else. And that is, from Microsoft's perspective, the PC feature set brought in some slightly compromised form to a box that is a lot more controlled and less hectic. The only thing I think sucks for them is that, man, they wouldn't have to be working all this stuff backwards if there was better coordination between the divisions of Microsoft years ago. When Windows Vista came out, there was the idea to unify Windows under gaming for Windows, with a lot of failure with regards to how its integration with Windows Live worked, which sucked. But concepts of it, like the games tab in Windows, the performance ratings in Windows, the unified save games folder, and all these things, actually were steps forward that were abandoned. at some point, and these things, if they were historically existent previously, they could have been used over time to have built up this library and this interoperability on PC that just isn't there anymore, because they kind of gave up with gaming for Windows and they just said like, oh, everything's a tablet. That's all we care about. We only care about tablet PCs. And then they gave up with that. And they kind of were like, oh, we need your Windows money. Please give us your Windows games money. So they brought back in DX 11, 12, all that stuff that happened afterwards that we know now. So, I feel like these are them having to work backwards to work on things that could have potentially been solved already a decade ago. But it is now the way it is, and they have competition from Valve. I would say really big competition from Valve when they didn't necessarily need to be this way. They ceded the market to Valve years ago when it didn't need to be that way.
Right. I mean, Oliver, you've been following the Valve trajectory with SteamOS, and they're in a much better position than Microsoft at the moment, I'd say.
I certainly think in terms of having that really strong end-to-end user interface, the ability to update your device through that interface, the ability to get pre-compiled shaders or to be able to compile shaders in advance through fossilized different kinds of elements that interface and operating system, they all work really, really well together. Microsoft has the advantage in the sense that games are natively built for Windows. They don't have to use a compatibility layer. That is a pretty big advantage. You would think, at least, that is a pretty big advantage. But Valve basically has like that kind of end-to-end solution for players already figured out through SteamOS, even through Steam Big Picture mode. Like, I never use the Xbox app nowadays. Really, I use it very rarely. I'm always using Steam Big Picture mode on my own personal PC, navigating it with a gamepad there. So yeah, I just feel like Microsoft has so much ground to overcome, and I'm hoping to see something big from them soon, or else I think this kind of effort will be maybe a little bit of a failed one, unless they can ultimately get to that level where Valve already is and hopefully exceed them, because that is kind of the benchmark for these devices. And I just think if you put like a Lenovo Legion Go versus the Lenovo Legion Go S, right? That new Steam edition, that new Steam OS edition version of the Lenovo Legion Go S, I think anyone would pick the SteamOS variant of that device in a heartbeat. I just think it's such a superior interface and a superior solution for handheld gaming.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you do wonder whether there might be more provisions within SteamOS to access those other games that aren't on Steam, because they're in pole position. They've got basic ownership of that market at the moment, and being able to access supplementary games, I think, would be a good thing for SteamOS. It's a bit tricky at the moment, isn't it?
It is.
But at the same time, it's we've got two companies here coming at things from different directions. We've got Steam that have basically owned that particular space, certainly in the handheld side, and then you've got, and it's kind of bizarre to say it, you've got Microsoft, which is essentially the full stakeholder in Windows, the underlying operating system, playing catch up here. And obviously, this is just a mock-up, most likely, but it's going to take more than a Steam button to actually entice people to actually use your system, I think. Mm-hmm. Interesting stuff, though. Interesting that it leaked at all. Fascinating stuff. It says here in the Verge article that the image disappeared when they told them about it.
Whoops.
Which kind of made me chuckle. But yeah, obviously we're going to be following this with much interest, but they've got to be radical. Microsoft have got to think radically on this and take out the wish fulfillment from what they want from the games market on PC and Xbox on PC, and just basically make something that is just great for the status quo and build on that, I think. Anyway, let's move on. So this week was the launch of Assassin's Creed Shadows. And we put out a couple of videos on that so far, probably 3 by the time you actually watch this direct. And I think we're pretty much very impressed with the game. We've got lots of supporter questions about Assassin's Creed we're going to be going through, but there is a bit of a bonus here, one might say, in that the version which we didn't look at, and there was another version that I wasn't even aware existed until Oliver told me about it. There is a Mac version of Assassin's Creed Shadows. And Oliver, you've tested it. And let's just say that the results are eyebrow raising in a Roger Moore style.
Yes, I have regrettably tested AC Shadows on Mac. So if you go back about a month ago, there was a bit of a kerfuffle over these specs that were published for AC Shadows on Mac, because
Right.
Ubisoft was saying that the fastest Mac chip at that time, which is the M4 Max, was only good for 1440p 30 with temporal upsampling from a lower resolution, and my 2021 MacBook Pro with its M1 Max chip was apparently only good enough for the minimum spec for AC Shadows, which is low settings, 720p resolution with DRS and temporal upsampling. So that's pretty brutal. That seems pretty low. Usually that's a GPU that's good for like 2060 level performance or maybe even 3060 level performance in Mac ports of PC titles. And that's obviously way below where comparable PC GPUs would be. So booting this up, I came in with somewhat low expectations. But I decided to start kind of a little bit higher, kind of where I would expect maybe the game to be. So 1080p resolution, metal effects quality, and medium settings. That seems like a pretty conservative place to start. And in the in-game built-in benchmark, I got 26 frames per second. That wasn't very good. But you have to keep in mind as well that quality in this case, it's not a fixed resolution. It's actually 50% axis res to 66% axis res. And for performance, it's 25% axis res to 50% axis res. So basically in this game, when you specify a performance level for the upscaling quality, upscaling resolution, it's actually always using DRS unless you set a custom value. So just keep that in mind for these tests here. I basically kept going in and doing progressively worse and worse settings until I just dialed in the game's suggested preset, which is basically as low as it will go. 720p low settings. I used DRS in performance mode with metal effects quality, and I got 32 FPS. That's not very good. Then I went to gameplay, started actually playing the game, and yeah, 32 FPS is basically representative. I got it to go into like the low to mid 20s during some bigger combat moments in the intro, which is pretty heavy, but not very good. I mean, the game looks pretty bad. Obviously, you're losing on an RTGI, but that's like the start of your problems. I mean, the image quality is atrocious. The settings are pretty bad. Then I went over to my M1 Ultra Mac Studio, which has a GPU that's usually good for like 3070 class performance, sometimes even higher, sometimes 3080 class performance. Pretty fast machine. And I got 36 FPS in the benchmark at the same settings as my M1 Max. So that's like 10%, 15% better. I also spotted some graphical issues when I booted the game for the first time, and some issues. The game wouldn't run with a custom resolution scale properly as well, which was a problem on that machine. So yeah, ultimately I'm kind of scratching my head over this. I tried to identify problems. And one thing you can do on Macs is you can open up the Metal HUD performance overlay, and that will show you two figures. It will show you GPU time and the present to present interval. And the present to present interval is basically the time between frame presentations. And the GPU time is obviously just GPU time. So if that present to present interval is like really high, way higher than GPU time, that tells you that's a good indicator that you're CPU bound potentially. And in this case, I was not really noticing that the present to present interval and GPU time are basically the same figure here. So I suspect the game is probably significantly GPU bound. And it does seem like it's pretty good at spreading out the CPU load across many cores. It kind of just saturates that CPU threading quite nicely with pretty low usage across many cores. Ultimately, I don't really know what's going on here. The port is, I would say, a very low quality on these machines. It seems minimally stable, like I was able to play it for 30 minutes, 40 minutes without it crashing. So that's good. But the performance level here is worse than a lot of games that are not native, like are running with Crossover or Game Porting Toolkit on Mac. So that's not very good. But I will say that judging from the spec sheets and judging from what people say online, the newer chips do seem to perform better. Like just the base model M4 apparently is as good or even better than my M1 Ultra in this game. And the base model M4 is obviously a tiny chip relative to the M1 Ultra. That's certainly a little bit odd. But even with like the very fastest hardware, people couldn't do like 60 FPS in this game. Even with an M4 Max, no matter what settings, you can't get 60 FPS. That just seems bizarre. And on the high end, still, when you're talking about like 1440p 30 with graphics hardware that's like easily beating a PS5, easily, that's not really acceptable in my view, relative to consoles and probably relative to PC as well. So I think one possible explanation for some of these performance divergences are that the M1 and M2 chips don't have support for mesh shaders unfortunately, in hardware. M3 and M4 does. Maybe that explains some of the relative divergence within that line. But in terms of the performance of Macs overall, I don't really understand it. It takes the cake, really, in terms of just being having very, very low performance relative to the capabilities of the hardware.
Right. I mean, I was just sort of watching your footage with some degree of dismay, and there were a few eye-opening moments. I particularly like the way the in-game frame time graph just seems to give up. It's just like all over the place. It's just, and then you lower the settings, and we're kind of like back within the bounds of reality. But the first benchmark you did there, I have no idea what's happening with those frame times, man. That's crazy. I literally cannot begin to fathom. But the mesh shader concept, if you haven't got hardware support for mesh shaders, we already have one example of a game, Alan Wake 2, where basically Remedy would throw up a dialogue box saying, "Here be dragons, you haven't got mesh shading." So the concept that that these chips are not performing in any way like their specifications would suggest. I mean, you've spoken to the developers. Mesh shading is a big thing in this game, right?
Yeah, it's a big part of the game's rendering. The game's virtual geometry system, which is similar to Nanite, extensively uses mesh shading to do the continuous LOD behavior that you see with clusters. So there is no cluster meshlet concept without those things, and you have to do a very rough and not performant emulation of that behavior with vertex shaders. With none of the benefits of that, there's going to be a multi-threaded nature of mesh shading, which is going to be completely lost most likely with the vertex version. So the inability for the game to scale at some point does make sense, I think, if it lacks mesh shaders. Right. That's just all pure fallback stuff there. That's on the GPU side of things on PC. I don't like RDNA 1, but the cutoff there is 2019, right? And this is a game coming out in 2025, and I find that very reasonable. But the other stuff that Oliver said about M4 chips being particularly not great and having trouble even getting 60 with you said it was lowering settings and dropping res and stuff. It's just not even getting to 60.
What, M4 or M1?
M4 Max.
Right.
Yeah. To me, that
or M3 Ultra as well.
Yeah, to me that points to other issues that usually in a game, dropping the resolution in a great, and those CPUs should be completely fine, right? Dropping resolution should get you there, and we're seeing at least on the console side and on PC that 60 FPS is very attainable. The game is a good CPU performing game. Actually, it is not stuttery and stuff. So them not achieving that, I do think it actually points to quality of porting issues. But one thing you could tell me about, Oliver, is have we seen many games on Mac that extensively push features like ray tracing at the same time as things like mesh shading before, or is that a pretty new thing?
That's a good question. To my knowledge, there are only a couple of games on Mac that support hardware ray tracing. I know Myst and Layers of Fear and possibly one or two other games do. And I'm not currently aware of any other games on Mac that support mesh shaders. So it's a very limited number of games. Macs having support for hardware accelerated ray tracing is a relatively new phenomenon. The M3 line was introduced in 2023, late 2023. That was the first Mac line with support for hardware accelerated ray tracing. They had some demos of RT being done in software on an M1 Ultra chip and things like that, but nothing truly in line with modern PC GPU features. In general, I don't think that gaming is that big of a focus for Apple when they're designing these GPUs. They want something that's going to be performant for Final Cut and AI, and gaming is kind of a secondary focus. And it often is inheriting features, I think, that are maybe more intended for mobile phones, where gaming is more of a priority, is slightly more of a priority there. So yeah. Certainly this is the most advanced game I've seen running on a Mac, and maybe they're just running into some limitations that other developers haven't quite encountered because they have such a complex suite of technologies here to deploy.
Yeah. Another thing to point out is that the game, per default, like a lot of like modern games, it's using GPU compute to do stuff in the world. It's doing, I didn't even talk about it in my video, but they're doing like procedural placement of like actual objects in the world on the GPU. You know, some of the like simulation stuff for like weather and wind and all these other things are just going to be flatline costs that won't scale with resolution. And when you get to those kind of things, especially like the compute shaders that are done for their nanite equivalent, those things are going to barely scale with resolution. You know, you're going to be more pixels are going to obviously help, but there's just a flat cost. And if that is inefficient in its own right on the hardware, then I could imagine it would cause issues getting up to 60. But still, it sounds pretty bad, especially the 300% CPU utilization that you see in the benchmark. Are you guys seeing that? It's like going up to 400%.
That's how Macs report. They report CPU utilization as if you're maxing at one core, that's 100%. So I've got
okay, that is bizarre.
Yeah.
I've never seen that before. Okay, well, I guess that's right. Never mind.
Yeah.
So, Oliver, a question for you. I mean, you say that Apple haven't really focused on gaming, and I'm hearing a lot of great things about that Mac Mini. You know, it's very competitively priced. You get the M4 chip. You get 16 gigs of memory, I believe.
Yep.
That's a pretty good deal. I mean, you know, could this be some, you know, I don't think Apple is going to be doing it as such, but if you're putting out hardware like that is that compelling, then surely there is an argument to be pushing this as like a mainstream computer. And then obviously that kind of changes the perception of what a Mac is and should bring more potential users to, you know, the gaming space for them.
Yeah, I mean, since I checked out GPTK Game Porting Toolkit a couple of years ago, I think it has improved quite a lot. I'd be eager to check that out again, perhaps.
Right.
I think that's probably the way forward for gaming on Macs, is like these kind of hack together custom translation layer type crossover tools to play actual versions of PC games on your Mac. So you're not getting, you know, there is an upcoming Cyberpunk port, for instance, to Mac, but you could play Cyberpunk on your Mac today with reasonable performance and good compatibility and not very many bugs or anything like that through crossover through GPTK. That's the route that I would suggest going. But certainly that Mac Mini, I think it's $600, M4, 16 gigs of RAM, only 256 gigs of storage, I believe, which is not ideal. But that's a lot of computer for a very low price. And of course, like all these Apple computers, because it's using this unified architecture in an SoC, and it's very power efficient, it comes in just a tiny, tiny little puck-sized case, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very beautiful computer. You couldn't get anything like that with comparable performance on a Windows computer for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's move on to some supporter questions about Assassin's Creed Shadows. And I'm laughing because we all know what's coming, Alex.
I know.
Let's bring up this question for... Alex, can you put the question back on the sheet? Thank you.
Yeah, it's back. It's back.
Yeah, this question from Kaveh Gorbati. Not to be too dramatic, but I really disagree with something Alex said in a previous direct. I think AC Shadows is yet another example of RTGI looking horrible without RTAO. Looks like software Lumen. I really got my hopes up that the new Anvil tech would have done what Alex said. But I'm once again looking at UE3 SAO.
What?
I guess I don't have a question, but I'm asking for an apology.
Let's just go back to UE3
He's not angry, Alex. He's disappointed.
If you want to look at what the heck that looks like, load up Arkham Asylum or Gears of War 2, and that is awful looking stuff. That is a hyperbolic statement if I ever saw one. To say the least, it is a lot more advanced than software Lumen, both in terms of coverage and detail. It's a lot better. Its stability is way higher than software Lumen. That is really obvious just playing the game. It's pretty rare to see actually any sort of boiling artifacts or extreme amounts of screen space information. So no, definitely not. The thing about any game like this in general, it's a large open world. Their BVH needs to have simplifications in it to run on console hardware or even mid-spec PC hardware, right? And so there are things that are not in their BVH, which will have then only probe and SSGI contributions to them. in the G buffer. And, that is going to make them look a bit more screen spacey. So you would see that more a bit on characters, as well as on dynamic objects that after they've been sliced or something like that. I think when they're sliced, they stop being world space at that point. But those things are more few and far between. And really, go to the video. Hopefully is out by the time you're seeing this. Go to that video. The difference is so massive. I have really no idea what you're talking about. Like, the game looks like that SSAO junk stuff you're used to like before, and then you turn it on after and it looks completely different. So I would be really curious what you're seeing. And maybe if it's not a bit of you are used to things being overly ambient occlusioned, is another thing. Like, you're used to things being over darkened. I'd be curious if maybe that is what is happening.
I think my favorite ambient occlusion was, I don't know if you ever saw it, LA Noire.
Oh yeah, I've seen
where
that.
It was kind of like almost like some licorice that was like overlaid in the corners. It was like
Another amazing one is the one in Fear 2. If you want to go back and see some incredible SSAO play Fear 2, nowadays, oh my God, just Google it. It's good.
Let's move on to the next question. No apology then, Alex.
No apology, definitely not. No, it looks great.
Not even an apology if he was offended. Which is to say,
well, maybe there.
the famous politician's apology there.
I'm sorry if you think you were offended.
This question from James Dene. Gentlemen, I am a simple man. I love Assassin's Creed games old and new. Shadows is a visual delight. A subjective question, if I may, to fill the news vacuum. Is it more interesting to analyse and review custom engines like Ubisoft's Anvil than Unreal, or is it all much of a muchness? Yours very sincerely and respectfully, a shinobi in the shadows. So I'm going to come to you again on that, Alex, because the answer, I guess, will be resoundingly yes, because we're seeing...
It's a huge yes. You can go
to talk about.
Well, the thing is, you don't know. Like, it's much more of an unknown number. So when you load it up the first time, you are generally greeted with questions and mysteries that you want to find out. And I find that that's the great part about custom technologies. Unlike Unreal, most of the time it is the exact off-the-shelf technologies you've seen already in potentially dozens of games. So there isn't anything surprising. And when you see artifacts, you start to expect them in games. When you see stutters, you start to expect them in games. Loading up Assassin's Creed for me was a joy because I am so used to very technically ambitious, dense open world games being CPU-matic problems. And here, it is very smooth and it is great. That's why I think, Oliver, you mentioned like when you were doing your work on it, like remind you a bit of Kingdom Come 2 with like the level of polish on release was another thing.
Yeah.
I think like you're saying here, James, I think it's a real delight and it's a really good looking game. So I'm really happy to look at this much more than I am an Unreal title, actually.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Final question. The mighty Ethan asks, hey DF, exclamation point. Do you think it's a major mistake for Ubisoft to cap the hideout area to 30 FPS in all modes? I've heard other podcasts talk about it as feeling terrible. Even people who normally don't care about frame rate and would be perfectly happy to play a game at 30 FPS. They say entering the hideout is jarring and it feels like it's running at less than 20, exclamation point. 30 FPS can be okay once you get used to it, but jumping between refresh rates prevents that. If even non-technically minded gamers are bothered, is this potentially a real problem for the game? Thank you for your thoughts, exclamation point. So Oliver, I think there's probably some merit to the concept of a jarring switch between 30 to 60 frames per second. Mm-hmm. Was it a mistake? I'm guessing that there's things that are happening in the hideout, possibly further on in the game, as you know, that kind of warrant that.
I would need to see what the hideout looks like in the end game, because certainly in the early game, it seems like a pretty pedestrian area that you can just tweak and have fun with your heart's content and build like stables and blacksmiths and things like this. But it's not that crazy in terms of complexity. I think it makes sense, a lot of sense, on say PS5 or Series X in their respective performance modes, if they wanted to kick in a 30 FPS refresh. Because there you're dealing with the transition between the normal baked GI that's in Anvil to the RTGI system. And so presumably there to maintain decent image quality, you'd have to lower the refresh. That makes sense. But on like a PS5 Pro in its performance mode, it feels very jarring. Even in the balanced mode, you weren't getting a 40 FPS hideout. It's still a 30 FPS hideout. That's certainly odd. But that seems to be an approach they take across the games. Like on all platforms, they kick in 30 FPS cutscenes, right? So it seems to just be like something a route they've decided to go down with this particular title, and that extends beyond the hideout.
What do you think, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, maybe so in a city there's less like interactable things than potentially a hideout could have at endgame, like all these things that you interact with and they produce game economy stuff, etc. Maybe CPU in that aspect, kind of doubt it. I also agree. I think especially on platforms like PS5 Pro and PC doesn't have the 30 FPS hideouts, by the way. But it does have 30 FPS cutscenes, and I disagree very strongly with that. I think that, like in any game, should be completely a user option. The game already does offer frame rate capping, and it is obviously capable on the programmatic side to switch it on and off at a whim. So I think it should be good to allow the user to do that. I also think they need to fix the issue on PC where cutscenes are 31 FPS and not 30 FPS. A lot of people have commented on that. I have as well too, on social media, I believe, or elsewhere. So yeah, I think in general, I do not like just arbitrary frame rate capping at all usually. And especially for the point of this is going to be running on a PS6 one day. This is going to be running on a massive PC of the future. It's really going to suck if it's only 30 FPS in like 10 years, right? So let's get rid of that.
Yeah, I've got issues with jarring changes to frame rate. I guess there is, 30 FPS cutscenes, 60 FPS gaming. I don't like it, but I can kind of understand why it happens. But for it to happen within gameplay, it is very, very jarring, actually. I don't think that's a particularly good move, but there must be a reason for it. On a sort of tangent, I was playing Indiana Jones and The Great Circle during my recent GPU reviews. It's got multi-frame gen support now. And it was odd because multi-frame gen didn't seem to work in the first level, the recreation of Raiders of the Lost Ark's intro. And I realized it probably doesn't because you're constantly switching between cutscenes that are capped to 60, and then your gameplay would be going up to like into the hundreds. But that was actually a problem just generally in the game, where basically every time a cutscene happened, you'd be going down to 60 anyway. And I think this sort of concept of having the ability of the game to run arbitrary frame rates and then other bits of the game not capable of running at arbitrary frame rates, I think it's a bad move. Yeah. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, so it's GDC week. John is actually at the event at the moment, but he's having far too much fun to actually tell us much about what he's been up to. He gave his own panel though. That's pretty great. But news has emerged from a distinctly newsless GDC of DXR 1.2, so an update to the ray tracing API from Microsoft there. And Alex, interesting stuff there, but not particularly new if you've got an Nvidia GPU.
No, this is not new at all if you have an Nvidia GPU. DXR, so DXR 1.1 came out in the immediate aftermath of RDNA 2 coming to PC, which would make it a 2020 thing. So it's been a long time coming. And as you know, RDNA 3, now RDNA 4, Ada Lovelace, Blackwell, all these things have, and of course Intel Arc.
Yes, Battle Mage.
And Battle Mage. And then Celestial, who knows, right? And then, so there's been a lot of innovation during that 4 to 5 year gap now. And we're essentially seeing right now with this update, two aspects of NVIDIA's innovations in terms of their naming being directly brought over. The first one is opacity micro maps, which in This is a feature which in DXR should prevent the invocation of any hit shader, and any hit shader occurs when ray tracing hits a triangle, but it is alpha tested, so it's like the outline of something, and then it has to completely avoid the hardware acceleration, go back to the beginning, and kind of test it in software. And this essentially converts all of the alpha tested stuff into geometric representations that are small, and allows them to hit naturally on hardware as a result of that. And it'll be a big speed up in scenes that have a lot of typically vegetation, hair, stuff like that, that uses alpha cards. And we've seen it in a number of titles that support Nvidia's own things. There's probably an OMM work there in Vulkan, as well as in the NV API equivalent that works under DXR, the extension there. The other thing is shader execution reordering. Now, this one's interesting because it came out with Ada Lovelace, and we saw it speed up path tracing workloads very specifically by allowing when you path trace, like a disparate amount of materials can show up, and if they're shaded out of order, so to speak, without them being binned and batched, the GPU utilization will go down as it's trying to do different things, essentially, one after another, not getting full utilization. SER will make them kind of be batched up into groups that are more efficiently processed with the large parallel nature of a GPU. That is the NVIDIA side of things. They required like a special API call for it to be done. It like replaced DXR 1.0 equivalent calls. But Intel actually with Arc had a very similar solution in hardware, a hardware unit that was taking care of this, and they wanted you to run games on Arc hardware, and I guess then as well with Battlemage, using DXR 1.0 because it would make this SER behavior occur in their hardware anyway. But a lot of games don't always use DXR 1.0 because they target consoles, right?
Yeah.
And they would use DXR 1.1, and because that's what RDNA really prefers. It's not meant for more intense ray tracing workloads at that point in time. And as a result, Arc hardware would kind of get the shaft, right? So this is interesting in that aspect of we're seeing a unification of a feature set that Intel and Nvidia had under this SER branding. OMMs, though, are going to have to be added to all the other makers' GPUs over time. Now, the little brief here that they have, which is like a screenshot, presumably from a presentation, shows take the next step in ray tracing. And it shows support from AMD, Intel, Nvidia, and Qualcomm. Oh, I forgot about them. Who doesn't? There's quotes from both Intel, Qualcomm, and Nvidia. And curiously, no AMD quote there. I would have almost expected that. But right off the bat, we'll see at least SER support from Intel. Qualcomm is going to have SER and OMM on future chips. NVIDIA already has it. But AMD, there's no sense of whether or not they were going to support SER at some point and OMM, but whether or not RDNA 4 does in any capacity is not here. Right. I kind of doubt it would almost, but it would be great if it did. So I would really like that. I want to say one last thing is that I complain a lot about Microsoft being really slow with the DirectX, and I've complained about them being slow with DXR. And I think this is still a little slow, and it's a little bit because Blackwell now just came out with stuff like linear swept spheres, mega geometry. They had their motion blur testing advancement thing that they brought in there with Ampere. There's obviously things on the Intel side that they are probably doing too. And, I feel like when they bring in these large features, they kind of don't map them well towards the future, towards like more speculative uses of the hardware. And kind of like DX back in the day would like demand something and then hardware would catch up. And there's a little bit less of that now. It seems like everyone's kind of just, it's like kind of like picking up the pieces after the innovation's already done.
Right.
And I would really like Microsoft to be even more innovative than this.
Yeah, you would expect that there would actually be partnerships to produce these features across the board with all vendors at the same time. But it does seem to be the case that pretty much since 2018, Nvidia has been delivering the key advances in rendering, at least. And everybody catches up years later. So I'm assuming, Alex, that the AMD and the Intel and Qualcomm chips will need to have bespoke hardware to get at those features, right? They can't be retroactively supported on existing GPUs.
For OMMs, yes. SER, like I said, Intel is fine there for the moment, but AMD, there's no quote here. I presume it's the case. Qualcomm says that, at least.
Because that's the issue, right? I mean, we're talking about features here that debuted in Ada 2 years ago. Now we've finally got Microsoft providing the unification in the API, and then we're going to need to wait another X years until that feature is actually standard across all GPU vendors. So, it just makes people consider Nvidia just being at the forefront yet again. I think this is a problem that does need to be addressed fundamentally by Microsoft as the kind of standard bearers of the API, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting that we haven't really had any sort of news on DX13 or advances on DX12 until kind of now, right?
Yeah. I think a really good example of this is DirectSR. It's kind of, like Streamline came out. That's NVIDIA's push for that. And it's fine, I guess, if AMD or Intel don't support it completely. NVIDIA is not always the most trustworthy partner in this space. So I get that. But DirectSR is like the equivalent of Streamline built into Windows, DirectX. But it's not, I don't think any games used it yet. And it's also not forward-looking. It's only covering image reconstruction. And as we've seen, FrameGen has exploded. Ray reconstruction has exploded on a smaller scale, but AMD is already looking to support it. And if that DirectSR API included optional inputs, kind of like NVIDIA does with DLSS, you can put in optional inputs that they just say, like, throw in all these things and maybe they'll work in future versions of DLSS and you'll get better quality then. If they'd done that with their DirectSR, instead of being so like lower spec and more constrained, then it would be more future compatible from the get-go, right?
Yeah.
And these are things that they just don't do. And it's no wonder no one wants to adopt it then, almost. Like, I've never, like, you look at any of the titles, that come out that support DLSS and FSR. If you go into them and look at their file structure, you'll see Streamline in there every single time, almost. So it's like, a little bit late there, maybe a little bit late here.
Okay, any thoughts, Oliver?
Yeah.
No, I would just echo Alex's comments completely. And certainly when you're looking at a demo like the mega geometry demos that we saw back at CES, those are incredible things, and they're being led completely by vendor-specific technology. And it does seem to be the case that if Microsoft is going to integrate these technologies into DirectX, into DXR, they need to do so in a manner that is a little bit less lagging than they have been doing so far, or else we'll just have a future that's dominated by vendor-specific technologies without any kind of cross-vendor standardization that would be so helpful, I'm sure, for graphics development on PC.
Yeah, I mean, super resolution, ray reconstruction. There's a direction of travel that's being established by one company, frame generation. And Microsoft, as I said, as the standard bearer of the API, they've got to be a bit more responsive to that. Anyway, so yesterday, just as we were considering the complete lack of news for this direct, The Last of Us Part 2, Naughty Dog revealed the recommended specifications for the game. And Alex, bearing in mind that we are essentially looking at a port of a PlayStation 4 game, Once again, Roger Moore with his raised eyebrow is not particularly impressed with what we're seeing here.
Yeah, I mean, this is Nixie's and Naughty Dog, but back in the day, it was Iron Galaxy?
Iron Galaxy, yes.
And Naughty Dog, and let's be honest with you, I don't think the T-Loop Part 1 port was good, and I also think there's issues with the Uncharted Thief Collection, whatever it's called. Yeah.
The Thief Collection.
Oliver knows the name better than I do.
Legacy of Thieves.
Thank you. But yeah. And here, these specs don't inspire confidence on like one level, and it's the GPU recommended specs. And so, or even just the minimum specs. So if you go back in time to games that are very PS4 specific or even like Xbox specific, a GPU like an RTX 3060, for example, under the recommended specs, which here is medium settings at 1080p 60, that GPU in any game that is a PS4 base game is going to be getting way more than just double GPU performance at the same resolution, quite a lot more. You look at just generic compute power, you look at versatility of that GPU, anything dedicated bandwidth, it's way higher.
Yep.
And yet here, I don't imagine the PS4 settings are going to be low in this game based upon The Last of Us Part 2's port. I imagine they'll probably fall around medium, and seeing something like an RTX 3060 potentially only doubling that performance speaks to a game that is almost really strangely poorly performing on the GPU on PC for some reason, where I'd really question why it's a PS4 game.
The other thing, of course, the Radeon RX 5700 has the same amount of compute units as the PS5 GPU. It runs at a lower clock, but not that much lower. So, and that's a GPU that's very, very similar in many ways architecturally to the PlayStation 5. So, that game was running, 1440p at 60 on the PS5. Yep. So, yeah, that is slightly onerous, I would say. Yeah, it's a bit baffling. Yeah, I can certainly see where you're coming from, where it seems to achieve PlayStation 5 style performance, you actually need to go up a rung or two on the GPU ladder to get that equivalent performance. That is, obviously a bit concerning. And of course, if this is fundamentally a PlayStation 4 game that ran at 30 frames per second, so running at 60. I guess Ryzen 5 3600 kind of makes sense. It is interesting, though, that there is sort of scaling on the CPU as you go up in resolutions and settings, but I don't really think that's kind of weird. I think from my perspective, looking back at the Last of Us Part 1 port, there were many issues there. CPU was an issue there for sure. But that was basically because it was streaming in a lot of assets which the PlayStation 5 had hardware support to do. So I guess that possibly would explain this. It will be based off the off the PS5 version, not the PS4 version, fundamentally. Yeah, it's a bit odd, but kind of the way things seem to be going with these ports. And I guess generally across the console generation, it is the sense that the requirements of the PC version do generally increase over time. But even so, I'd say it's kind of quote unquote not great, but expected based on The Last of Us Part 1. I don't know. Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, to me, after my highly traumatic experience with the Mac port of AC Shadows, I am a little bit more forgiving of this, possibly. Right. But yeah, needing 3070 level kind of GPU performance to hit similar marks, I would presume, as PS5, that's not ideal. But I do kind of appreciate the spec list, though, just because they're providing you a pretty straightforward set of specs without upscaling, without DRS. I'm fine if you include upscaling in a spec sheet, but when you include DRS, it gets kind of fuzzy in terms of the numbers and in terms of what level of performance you should be able to reasonably expect on a given class of hardware. So I do appreciate that. In terms of features, though, it's kind of like the Nixie's special, I suppose, of just every upscaler pretty much. I actually don't think XESS is mentioned, but DLSS is mentioned, FSR 3.1 and FSR 4, obviously important to have both, I suppose. Texture quality, law distance, volumetric quality, shadow quality, AO reflections, and ultra-wide support, and there's some new content as well in there for existing PS5 players as well as PC players. Personally, I don't know, The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered, I covered it on PS5 and then PS5 Pro when that version was released back last year. And I don't know, it was not the most transformative upgrade over the original. Like you said, Rich, this basically is a PS4 title. The only substantial upgrades, in my experience, were things like image quality, obviously. You could improve image quality quite a lot, especially on PS5 Pro. And the distance that you saw, like vegetation, the law distance for certain things like this, that improved a fair bit as well. But other tweakables, including other tweakables they suggested in the listing for the game, like shadow quality, texture quality, those differences didn't really materialize. And there were some curious differences like missing depth of field during gameplay in some instances, things like this. So I don't think this is like the most exciting PC port. Certainly there's no suggestion that you're getting anything like improved ray tracing or anything like that in this porting effort. But it should hopefully be good for PC players who have yet to experience this game some 5 years on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it should be okay if Nixie's is on the job.
I'm a little worried about.
Sorry, I'd be interested to see what's going to happen with the texture quality side of things.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to say. Because, okay, so guys, this is a PS4 game. It's got PS4 texture quality. Those fit within like 3 to 4 gigabytes, right? Mm-hmm. on a PC level GPU. Usually, like back in the day, it wasn't too hard to get those PS4 quality textures on a 4 gigabyte GPU, right?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, like pretty much universally across the board. If this game for some reason has trouble fitting those PS4 quality textures into 8 gigabytes, I may be pretty negative because I just wouldn't understand it, because the game's got fine texture quality on the PS4. It's nothing like ridiculous. Like 8 gigabytes is the amount of memory that the entire PlayStation 4 has. And Last of Us Part 1 Remastered, which is basically a remake, I think it was broadly similar in visual quality to the Part 2 in a lot of ways. So I just hope there's none of that, like I'm questioning myself and like why this game looks the way it does and runs the way it does. The last couple Nixie's porting efforts have been kind of like silently shoved out the door. And I hope they don't do that here. We at least got the specs this time a bit beforehand. The game is still not available in a whole bunch of countries, by the way, on Steam. It hasn't really been advertised other than its initial announcement and this blog right now. So maybe we're going to see something similar, but I really, really hope not. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, Alex, there's one thing that stands out to me based on the high settings here, which is that they're recommending an 8 gigabyte GPU for high settings, which you wouldn't do if you couldn't run the textures at high.
Well, I say that, but in the past in Nixie's ports, there's been like issues with on 8 gigabyte GPUs where there's performance degradations in like certain scenes because they do allow things to go resident in system memory a lot more than other titles do, and that just like really thrashes performance. And I found, I don't know, we'll have to see. We'll really have to see.
Anyway, we shall be looking at it, obviously, and we'll figure out some way of getting information out in a timely manner. With that, let's move on. So we had a lot of people asking for coverage of Rise of the Ronin, a PlayStation 5 port for PC. And, well, let's be honest, we haven't had time. Poor old Alex there. It's just been like
I wish I had time.
Ricocheting between one project and another. So speaking of, an attempt to try and get some information out in a timely manner, or rather establish a way of doing it, I took on the task of just looking at Rise of the Ronin on PC. Now, this doesn't actually include any console comparisons. It does basically just look at how the game runs on a mainstream PC. And by mainstream, I used an RTX 4060 paired with a Ryzen 5 3600, the classic, the mainstream PC that Alex actually uses for his reviews. And just some initial comments. It's a curious one. Let's put it that way. Good news is you do start with a shader burn. It's like 21,000 or something shaders. It pre-compiles, which is good. I do think there is possibly a bit of traversal stutter in the open world, but it doesn't seem to be shader stutter, which is good. Now, initially when I played the game, I thought, well, let's push things up a bit. I went for the high settings over standard, and 60 frames per second. Now, the settings are really interesting because the game does seem to want you to play either at 60 or 120, and I assume 240 if that is a possibility with your display. I don't know. It went up to 120 for me, and it supports dynamic resolution scaling, even with DLSS. Again, I think that's good. It's worth having, right? So 1440p DLSS dynamic, and that's what I'm testing here. Everything works just fine on the first couple of missions because it's prologue stuff, it's training stuff in confined areas. This level here is a bit more challenging in terms of typical stuff, particles, transparency effects, that kind of thing. And if we assume that the DRS scaler is going from 50 to 100%, I haven't checked that, but if we assume that is the case, we're starting to drop frames. That's not good. So I then shifted to standard settings, which I would assume is console equivalent. Still having some issues there. Standard settings. There is something a bit odd there even in the high settings, texture filtering suggested is 2x, which is kind of nuts. Another thing which might be wondering why we're using VSync here, the game just seems to want you to run with VSync. That's you turn VSync off, but then you have those DRS. It's still targeting 60 or 120. So and then you have DRS, and it still seems to make VSync happen. Possibly things will be different on a VRR display. I actually busted everything down to 1080p in an effort to increase performance. It doesn't quite work out. Cutscenes, there's actually frame rate limiters for cutscenes and gameplay. There is the sense there, I can't remember what happened on PlayStation, but there is the sense there that the cutscenes are generally heavier, and therefore the DRS can't cope. And then you can go down to 30, I guess, if you fancy that. And then everything just sort of worked okay. I got to the open world, played through a bit of that, and performance was okay. I think locked 60 on standard settings would be good, except it wasn't locked 60, which is a bit problematic. And I played up to where we get to the first city. And kind of like things started to go a bit wrong. We were looking at some pretty lurching frame rates. So what I did then was basically to exit, invoke Riva Tuner, simply to get an idea of what's happening on the CPU. And what's happening on the CPU is quite remarkable. Typically on what you might call a suboptimal game, workload, you'll see utilization spike to 90, 100% on one or two cores, right? What's happening here is that it's actually spiking to 100% on all cores. So either the CPU is being totally and completely hammered and overwhelmed, or we've actually got a pretty good threading model here. Possibly the latter, because frame rates are kind of still relatively high. There are some lurching stutters though, right, Alex?
Yeah, that's the main thing that concerns me. If a game was consistently frame time limited by the CPU, but was pretty consistent, then I would say that's really good, actually. But
yeah, the City is just a bit of a game changer on the CPU side by the look of it. I do think, based on the fact that we're running on standard settings here, VRAM isn't an issue according to the in-game VRAM meter. texture quality is on standard settings. That CPU stuff is highly worrying, I think, in terms of, bearing in mind it's built to be an open world game. So, yeah, I think, what can I say about this? Mediocre to underwhelming. It looks as though the stuttering isn't too much of an issue unless you're CPU limited, but we do seem to be CPU limited. And you're probably going to need something like a 5600 minimum, really, to make sure you get consistent 60 FPS. It doesn't seem to be happy with arbitrary frame rates. It definitely seems to want you to be playing at either 60 or 120. DRS in there that does support DLSS. That's a good thing, I think. Just expected more, especially when a game that looks like this runs like this. I mean, Alex, I don't know whether it was unkind or realistic, but you were talking about the city being reminiscent of what you saw in Assassin's Creed 3.
I'd say that's pretty realistic. I mean, just look at the way the streets are done and like the buildings themselves. Obviously, there's things like the character models are better here. That is something I would definitely give the game, but the rest of the technology base does seem pretty thoroughly old at this point, actually.
Yeah, I don't think it was ever sort of designed to be, anything like Lumen or Nanite or anything like that. But it is an aged-looking game, I'd say, just generally. Something I think we pointed out in the PS5 review as well. I don't know if you have any experience of the PlayStation version, Oliver, because I haven't.
Well, I actually took a look at it in Direct 154.
Wow.
Back, I guess about a year
What
ago.
a memory.
Yeah, back about a year ago, I covered it. I think we had the final build of the game, but we can only talk about the first hour or so of it. So I provided some of my thoughts, and I did not think too highly of it then. There were a couple nice technical touches, but certainly it was not delivering anything that was especially compelling in terms of its overall visual appearance or performance on PS5 hardware there. I think it's very much the case on PC as well. I do feel spoiled, especially by AC Shadows recently, which obviously isn't helpful to this game, that it's covering such similar content, similar kind of world, similar kind of setting, and it looks so much better than Rise of the Ronin. But yeah, the performance here does not seem too great. But I'm not too sure that performance on PS5 was that hot either, so maybe that's just to be expected.
I did review the footage we put out, and it was not great, not consistent.
Right.
Yeah.
Not great.
I mean, the game does support ray tracing. I didn't even try that based on what I was experiencing with standard settings on the 4060. So, yeah. And, to be fair, 4060, in terms of sort of general level of performance, it's kind of on par with the console, with the PlayStation 5. Obviously, there's the whole memory issue. There's the whole PCI Express issue. Yeah, but even so, I did expect to be running it better than 1080p with better than standard settings. But it is what it is. Not a big fan of the game, have to say. Entertaining enough. I think if you're interested in it, as long as you've got a decent PC, you'll get something out of it. But it does seem to be a case of being visually underwhelming compared to the amount of compute you kind of have to throw at it. And that's what I think of Rise of the Ronin.
Thank you, Rich.
Yeah, okay.
Seriously, I would not like reviewing this because this is a game I'd probably have to say negative things about, and you took one for the team here.
As they say.
Yeah. It's another Katana engine classic as well.
Yeah, I mean,
sometimes a problem.
You know, what can I say? Underwhelmed. But with that, let's move on. Okay, so that's the end of the news for this week. So let's crack on directly with supporter Q&A. This is the part of the show where every week I post on Patreon asking our supporters to come up with a range of questions and quotes for the news stories that we do, and also to suggest questions for this particular segment. I choose the best or rather the ones that intrigue me the most, or the ones that I think that we can actually provide meaningful answers to. Going to kick off with this question from Peter. Hi DF crew, hope you have all had a great week! Exclamation point. Could have been better. I was thinking recently that it may be useful for some if PC versions of multiplayer games had a quote-unquote console settings options within the graphics menu, likely based on PS5 settings. This would almost be a developer-optimized setting in effect, and beyond maybe resolution adjustments, provides an easy one-click solution to achieve the best balance of visual and performance. Beyond the obvious plus for yourselves when it comes to analysis, do you think this would be a welcome addition for gamers? So, Alex, this is a really timely question, bearing in mind some of the discussions we had this week, because we saw a tweet. I'm not sure it actually bore out with actual benchmarking, but it was a screenshot of Assassin's Creed at 1080p with quality level upscalings maxed, running at like 70 FPS on a 5090. And, obviously that's shocking. That's outrageous. I'm not sure it actually bore out compared to actual benchmarks from reputable benchmark people like Computer Base, who seem to be getting the same result at native 4K. But this particular thing is the point being made by Peter here is actually a really good idea and something that we've been pressing for some time. And it's something which people need to understand that ultra is ultra. It's like the whole idea of ultra settings is to take the existing systems within a game and push them to their theoretical limits, just to, in essence, provide future-proofing support for the PC hardware of tomorrow. That should be the rationale between what ultra setting is. So the concept that users should be dialing up everything to ultra on today's hardware, it's here be Dragon's territory. You shouldn't be expecting to get outstanding performance. The name itself is telling you that this is, ultra level stuff, and maybe you don't have an ultra level PC. Chances are you won't. Now, what Peter's suggesting here is a preset in the graphics menu that has console settings, and he's word for word explained our approach to optimize settings. Let's just describe how he said it again. A developer optimized settings and beyond resolution adjustments provides an easy one-click solution to achieve the best balance of visuals and performance. And developers do this for every single game they put out, because you can't run at ultra settings for the most part on a console. That's not what they're built for. You're designing a game primarily, I guess, for those consoles to run well on those consoles. Therefore, you make trades, and those trades, by and large, translate one-to-one to PC. Another point that Peter's saying here, for multiplayer games, I guess that there is some sort of rationale for multiplayer games, both in terms of, fairness, same level of visual experience, but it doesn't just apply to multiplayer games. The concept of optimized settings, which is console settings for the most part, applies to single player just as well.
Yeah. So there are limits to optimized settings in the aspect of if you have transformative technologies on the table, you would potentially avoid them. If you have like large architectural differences, you could go for other things in general. Like you could, instead of like a console version may boost shadow map quality or something like that. But maybe if you had a really good PC GPU, you would just keep shadow map quality more middling and instead use like a transformative technology, right? Like reflections, like RT reflections or something like that. So there are obviously nuances there, but taking those away, the developer came up with things that look good enough on generally hardware that is equivalent in a lot of ways to the lower spec PC parts that we see being so popular on Steam. And I think it would do them a great benefit to label those options as such in the game so that people don't feel like they're missing out on anything. And I think this FOMO thing, this my PC is good enough for ultra thing, there's a lot of historical reasons for it. But I think if people knew ahead of time that medium was the standard setting that is used on consoles, then I think it would save a lot of people that headache from, they shouldn't throw it up to ultra, but from throwing it up to ultra, because they would understand better that those settings are not standard. And the reasons why I think people do this in general is just a lack of knowledge. But I think people even who are knowledgeable maybe grew up during the time when PC gaming was like tail end Xbox 360 to that like Xbox One PS4 territory, where tail end of Xbox 360 PCs were really running circles around those consoles, GPU and CPU wise. So the games would come out with ultra settings, but they were all designed around these consoles, and those ultra settings wouldn't scale too high anyway. So they'd be running stuff like 1080p 60, 1440p 60 at a time when it was 720p, maybe 30 on the consoles. But then you get like to like later on, and I think that kind of persisted for a bit because the PS4 and Xbox One, GPU wise, PS4 is pretty okay when it comes out, but like the CPU situation was way different. And I think people maybe who grow up during that time period are used to Ultra being not so meaningful and also mainly meant to run on a Jaguar CPU. So they come to this current generation of games which scale way higher than they did in the past like 15, 20 years almost. And they're just like slapped in the face when they turn things up. And I think so there's like two ways you can come at it, but I think the developers can really help people out by giving us console equivalent settings.
Yeah, I agree. Oliver?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would appreciate console equivalent settings in some cases. For our work, it certainly is quite helpful. And I think in general, it's very helpful to understand what the kind of standardized experience is meant to be from the development side. And that does, oftentimes dialing in the medium preset or the high preset gets you most of the way there in terms of getting down to like the developer intended optimized settings. But in this case, this would basically be a way to shortcut that process. But I do think developers have good reason often to want to obscure to some extent their settings on console, because oftentimes it doesn't make the console look so flattering if, for instance, in Control, they're mostly running with like the low settings preset, right? Even though ultimately the name of a preset is really just a name that implies some kind of relative positioning, but it doesn't imply absolute resolution figures or absolute positioning in terms of features or anything like that. So that's certainly an issue there potentially for developers and for advertising games. But I think the area in which I think this is most interesting potentially is actually in multiplayer games, where there is a reason to homogenize features and homogenize settings across platforms for gameplay reasons. That's actually usually where you see some of this emerge in a more profound and more significant way. In titles like Call of Duty Warzone, for instance, where they need to homogenize settings, for instance, for foliage across platforms so players can't get an undue advantage by lowering settings to a certain degree or increasing settings to a certain degree. That's actually where I see this coming in a more real way for PC players.
Yeah. I mean, what can I say? There's this perception of what actually is an optimized game, which is kind of bizarre. Kingdom Come Deliverance obviously was mooted as being a game that ran really well on, but it's a game, I think so. That was the case because a lot of people were running it at ultra and getting a good experience, when in actual fact, is the concept of what ultra is between one game and the next varies dramatically. Then you had the situation with the Ubisoft massive games, Outlaws and Star Wars Outlaws and Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, where they were worried that people would just ramp everything up to the max. So you actually have to use a launch switch in order to actually unlock what are actually ultra settings, which is an easy way to sort of circumvent that. I think the concept of providing those console equivalent settings is actually a good one, because, ultimately the current generation of consoles are PCs, it's that AMD PCs. There are going to be sort of instances where, what do you do about upscaling? Avatar, for example, can go as low as 720p on its performance mode, which is sort of kind of optimal, but kind of not. So it's definitely a case where I think users need to be aware that, there is no sort of, typically it's not the case that, consoles are always on medium or always on high. Each system is going to have a different optimal position. I think that's not really represented by the concept of having presets that kind of force you to high or medium or ultra. It's tricky, but I honestly think that, just a default selection that is the console selection is probably a good way forward. And the idea that Ultra comes with a here be dragons warning, we've designed this for the hardware of tomorrow. At least people will be aware. It will make them think twice before just ramping everything up to Ultra and expecting a super optimal experience. I think it's an area where there can definitely be more transparency and better implementations, I think. With that, let's move on. This question from Gimme More Frame Rate, and it's an interesting one. The latest Switch 2 leak mentions a 120Hz LCD with VRR and HDR support. While the VRR feature has me excited, I'm curious, what's your take on HDR implementation on a mobile device with an LCD screen? Do you think it can deliver a true HDR experience, or is it more of a marketing bullet point in this scenario? So I haven't got the source for this particular leak, but apparently it's somebody who does have a very decent track record. But at the same time, I'm kind of finding it hard to believe. What do you think about this, Oliver?
Well, in terms of this person's question about HDR in particular, there are LCD technologies that can do a pretty credible job of representing HDR content, and those are basically devices with mini LED LCD backlight technology, where you can basically have per zone brightness control in a similar manner as you'd see on televisions. And there are some of these mini LED panels emerging in devices now. Like I think there are a couple in these portable Android-based gaming handhelds. There's obviously one in the 2022 iPad Pros as well, that line of devices. They had mini LED backlighting, and they got very bright and they got very dim, and they had a really good job of representing HDR content. On my MacBook Pro as well, it has the mini LED backlit LCD that looks actually really stunning, even relative to my television. It looks quite nice. So that would be the technology that would fit there. Alternatively, maybe they could have HDR support in general, and then maybe kick in a couple years with like a Switch 2 OLED style device that would deliver a credible HDR experience. That's another possibility there. In terms of a 120 hertz screen with VRR support, this rumor seems pretty ambitious to pair all those technologies together, those three technologies together for a Switch 2 device. Personally, I was just expecting a bog standard 60 hertz SDR IPS LCD of a similar quality probably to that Switch 1 LCD, perhaps a bit brighter, but probably not hugely advanced here. I would put money on this rumor not being 100% true. The leaker in question had provided the teraflop numbers in a rough range for the Switch 2 in advance of the potential clock specs being revealed by another leaker. Right. I don't think that's that huge of a jump in terms of actually having a lot of information about the device. Right. So I personally suspect that maybe this rumor is not 100% there in terms of credibility, although it will be interesting to see if one or more of these elements does show up in the finished Switch 2 device.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the question then is, I don't know. I can't really see it. I just think it's going to be a standard display. I think and that's kind of okay. I think the problem with, supporting technologies like VRR specifically is the concept that game makers might be building their games around VRR, and then you dock it and it's actually being docked to a standard 4K display without VRR. Similar with HDR. I guess that with tone mapping is less of an issue, but yeah, I can't see it. I'd love it for it to happen, but again, every time a Nintendo device is mooted, every time there are leaked specs, they're always tremendously higher than the actual device. And we're still coming off the concept that the Switch 2 had a 4 nanometer super efficient chip, which again, Occam's razor suggests that was never going to happen, and it didn't, as far as we're aware. Let's move on to the next question. This one's from my favorite supporter, Alex's Ray Trace Bottom. And the question is this: how many more node shrinks would it take to achieve PS5 level power in a handheld? If 15 watts is the target, would we need to reach a 1 nanometer process before we see performance close to current console level rasterization? I think, first of all, the whole nanometer thing is just marketing at this point. It doesn't actually relate to the size of transistors or gates or whatever. Wow. Actually, I'm going to level with you guys. I copied and pasted this question into the spreadsheet, and I was pretty sure it said PS4 level power in a handheld at 15 watts, which I still think is pretty challenging to do, even with Steam Deck and whatnot. Oliver, what do you think about this? We were talking about years away, I think.
Many years away. Just the 1 nanometer process technologies that are coming online, or even 1.4 nanometer, we're talking about, multiple years, 3 years, 4 years, longer potentially than that. 2 nanometer technology is only coming online, I believe, next year. And we've had 3 nanometer for a while. In PC GPUs, we're still in the 4 nanometer, 5 nanometer class of technologies at the moment. So yeah, I think on any near-term time scale, you're not really going to get there. We don't know what graphics hardware will look like on 3 nanometer or 2 nanometer process technologies, but I would assume the jump would not be as profound as, say, from 12 nanometer, 8 nanometer class technologies to 5 nanometers. I would assume it would be a much smaller jump there. And the handhelds are only really around PS4 level capability at like 15 or 20 watts. It's going to take a long time, maybe a very, very long time, before in compute terms and bandwidth terms, they're anywhere near a PlayStation 5 console. That just seems so far away. But I would also say that I think with the adoption of various AI technologies over the next few years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, you could probably end up with something that comes closer to the perceptual performance level of a PlayStation 5 console without necessarily getting there in terms of every single raw metric. I think that's more plausible. And in that case, I have to throw up my hands and say, well, whatever Jensen deems, perhaps it'll come at some point, who knows? But I don't think it will happen in a raw hardware metric sense.
Yeah, I think we're probably going to need to move on to the picometer scale, since if we're talking about 1 nanometer at this point.
Yeah. The term they're using is angstroms, but yeah.
Angstroms. Okay.
Angstroms.
Yes, it's going to take a lot of node shrinks, and Oliver is quite right that it just doesn't make sense to scale in that way. There's going to be different techniques that will give you perceptually very similar results, and it's in the same way that Nvidia is kind of going down this path now of starting to talk about performance based on software in combination with hardware as opposed to just hardware only. And there's a lot of pushback to that, but that is basically the direction of travel, I think, in terms of all levels of semiconductor relating to games, certainly. PS5 level power in a handheld at 15 watts. Well, it's requiring like 200 at the moment. So that is like over an order of magnitude more power being consumed to produce those results. And for what? You don't really need a 4K handheld at this point. Interesting nonetheless. Any thoughts, Alex?
Yeah, I just think what it's designed to do doesn't need to do that anyway. 4K is useless on a handheld, more or less. So I'm very curious though what the semiconductor industry does in about 10 years. Because, I just always remember years back, the talk was always like new substrate, new processes to make something that is not just made of silicon. But it's kind of like fallen by the wayside. No one talks about it anymore. So I'm very curious to see what the next breakthrough actually will be, or if it's just like stagnant and we have PS5 level power and performance for a very long time, actually.
Well, the PS5 Pro itself is indicative of, if not stagnation, certainly a change in strategy as to how you're going to get improvements in visuals. I think that's definitely the case. We are looking for some kind of breakthrough in semiconductor fabrication, though, that's for sure. And it's being borne out. One thing I pointed out to the team a couple of weeks back is all of these new GPUs that are coming. A lot of them are awfully like the RTX 3090.
Yeah.
There's so many GPUs available now that are like within 10% of the 3090 plus or minus. It seems to be this sort of sweet spot that nobody can really push beyond in a cost-efficient way. But anyway, I digress. Let's move on. This question from Xerxes, not sure. Hello, DF. My question is regarding the CPU reviews the industry do, and if we need to rethink how we approach them, but more in a realistic PC scenarios compared to consoles. Looking at the reviews of the 9950X3D and the 9800X3D, it seems pretty clear the latter is better value. I personally went ahead and upgraded my 13700K to a 9800X3D, only to find that the moment I have anything else besides my games open, Discord streaming, YouTube in the background, or even Spotify, the game drops performance, sometimes to ranges below my old chip. My question is, why do most reviewers still review gaming CPUs as this monolithic, single-task, single-game situation where that's not how most people will use them and mimics more of a console usage than a PC environment? Well, it's an interesting question, and I am reminded actually of the Ryzen 1 review period, where we got these chips in for review, and the benchmarks were stratospherically good, right? Because, 8 cores, cheap prices, what's not to like? And then we were looking at the gaming scenarios, and it was like, I even got in some really great G-Skill memory, which I think you've still got, Alex, because I gave that to you.
Yeah.
And but we couldn't get gaming performance, apart from in Crisis, oddly enough, to be better than a 3770K. That's right. And that's disappointing. And, the response to AMD was like, but have you tried streaming with it at the same time? Have you tried doing this? Have you tried doing that? Basically doing things at the same time to occupy the other cores that the games weren't particularly using. And in those scenarios, exactly as Xerxes is saying here, if you're doing other things with your CPU and not devoting the CPU task power to all of the tasks going on, not the gaming, then yes, there's going to be a degradation in performance. But going back to how we review these things, does everyone really run? I guess Discord is a thing that people would be running in parallel with gaming. But, ultimately you're running a whole series of other tasks which people may or may not be doing when they definitely will be gaming, if you see what I mean, simultaneously. And you kind of have to come up with various use case scenarios, which means like duplication of benchmarks, which means exponentially increasing the workload in actually making a CPU review. And we only have typically a few days, at most a week, with these products to review them. I don't know what you think about this, Alex.
And the idea of a multitasker review is an interesting specialty review that could be done for a product, I think. Not everyone should do that for the same reason not every channel looks at the same stuff anyway. But I think that is a very interesting one. I'm very curious about this watching a YouTube video while gaming thing, though.
Yeah.
I definitely can't do that. Holy crap.
2 displays, dual screen.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I've listened to music before while getting B-roll for a game that I think the story is like bleh, right? I've done that tons of times. It's pretty often actually, but I have a different setup, capture, I've got a capture setup. So, yeah, but that is an interesting idea, and I've never seen anyone look at that. And it wouldn't surprise me too much if the E-cores really are going to be threaded that way in Windows to make them be used in those moments. Finally, they have a use, darn it, right? So that'd be pretty cool to actually see a bench of.
Yeah, I'm just curious as to what would be tested, because I don't know how many use case scenarios can we come up with. I don't know. Oliver, thoughts?
If you want to multitask in that fashion, I think there are CPUs for that, in particular, like the high-end Intel CPUs, and then like the Ryzen 9 series CPUs from AMD. Something like the 9950X3D, I'm sure would be better for that purpose. But it would be interesting to see tests in that fashion, but just performance drops with like a web browser open or Discord open, maybe I wouldn't expect to see that as much. But if this user is talking about like Discord streaming, like streaming in addition to gaming, that's obviously a specialty workload that needs some accommodation, either in terms of a second PC or in terms of having a fairly high-end CPU there. Personally, though, I don't really empathize with this problem as much because I don't use my PC for anything but gaming. I use my Mac for everything, basically any kind of personal use, work use, whatever. So I rarely have anything open but Steam, the game itself, and maybe fan controller, or a couple other little widgets like this. So personally, I'm not too inclined towards having a very multitasking heavy workload, but I do understand that for some people that's probably a big part of their gaming use, especially if they're playing games like, MMOs and social games and Counter-Strike. I'm sure you're having a lot of kind of voice chat and comms and Discords open and things like that might make this workload a bit more relevant.
I'm fascinated at the concept that Spotify could diminish gaming support performance on a 9800X3D. That suggests to me that Spotify's got issues. To be honest, maybe I'm wrong. It's an interesting conceit. I think it's an interesting idea. The question is, what would the workloads be, and to what extent is it actually relevant to a lot of the audience? I think there is an interesting situation there with the E-cores there, Alex, because chances are those sort of tasks would be delegated to the E-cores when gaming. Well, let's just say that the advantages of the E-cores are questionable, right? Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to the next question. This one from Shauna San Lucas YHC24. I can only assume that's how it works out. I don't know. Apologies if I've got that wrong. Hi, DF Crews. I love the idea that there's more than one DF Crew. That would be amazing. Anyway, hi, DF Crews. I'm wondering if gaming consoles were to disappear entirely, would developers be able to optimize their games specifically for PC? This scenario is highly unlikely to occur, as the complete disappearance of gaming consoles could lead to the downfall of many major game companies as well. However, I am very curious to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you. Now, before I put the question over, I'm going to say that I did have a meeting with somebody very, very high up in the industry last year at Gamescom, who suggested, who asked us, what do we think games are targeting when they're developed? And we did say, likely PlayStation 5. And they took issue with that and said that it's actually going to be the most mainstream PC configuration. I would actually take issue with that based on some of the games we've seen running on 8GB GPUs, Alex. But what do you think? What would happen if games consoles disappear? Certainly the PC would be the focus if it isn't already to some degree.
I mean, historically, just look at things built in the 90s and the early 2000s or the 80s that were specific to the PCs of the time. There was an entire market of games that only came out on PC. Now games come out to a lot more platforms. There's still a lot of PC-only games, of course. But if you look at that, you'll see that there was the minimum requirements were a lot harder. The recommended requirements were the standard, and there was ultra settings that were just no one used. So I think that would be a reasonable scenario, but I also think developers now are a little bit more mindful of the lower spec having a really good experience, whereas before it was like, John's showed it before, games running on what do they call that thing? Like a Power VR card, and it's awful, right? They wouldn't allow that barely DirectX 6 class experience anymore. It'd be a lot. They would still optimize games though, like they still do. So I think it would be that much different, actually.
I don't think it would be that much different. I mean, we are in the situation now where the average GPU is like a 4060 based on the Steam hardware survey, or a 3060, which are kind of ballpark console. And then you've got this scalability thing that you talk about, which I think, based on the existence of PC handhelds, based on the proliferation of iGPUs in laptops, based on Xbox Series S, scalability is definitely a thing now. Oliver?
Yeah, I think one thing you would see is probably a bit of a greater focus on very high-end hardware, but then also concurrently maybe more of a focus on low-end hardware as well, like that scalability like you mentioned, because the baseline is no longer Series S or PS5 or whatever from someone who's looking to get into games for, let's say, a $300 or $500 price point, it's going to be whatever like commodity APU ends up in a 2025 low-end laptop or something. And in that case, you do need to be more flexible. And you do see this with some PC-oriented games that are really built around the platform and are built like MMOs, for instance, that are built for a wide range of audiences across the world that may not have high-end PC hardware, but almost certainly do have a PC. That's something that you see. But in general, yeah, I wouldn't expect it to change a whole lot. I think the market dynamics of a PC-led market for video games, of a PC-driven market, entirely driven market for video games, I think that would dictate a lot of things around game production that would completely change the way that games are probably built over the long term, I would suspect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, at this point, consoles are kind of PC, so I don't think there'd be a major change. And I do think there has been this move to scalability. Principally in the pandemic, there was a lot of laptops that were sold with pretty decent iGPUs. And of course, since then, we've had like Steam Deck, we've had all of the PC handhelds that are AMD powered. So I don't think it would change too much based on current trajectory. I'm kind of curious to see what's going to happen with Xbox, if it, assuming it does transition into some kind of more PC-like device. And maybe at that point, it would be PC that takes point as like lead platform, so to speak. But anyway, interesting question. Let's finish up with this one from Gordon Lynn. Alex, what's your recovery regime after a particularly bad PC review experience? How do you recover from your polite, simmering indignation?
Well, a really hot bath. No, but seriously, I just probably take a bit of time away from my edit. I think the editing process itself, usually when I'm script writing, that's when the polite indignation comes out. But while I'm editing the game, I'm actually enjoying the editing process and pointing out the stuff in the editing process. Like, it's kind of fun to like line up words with video in general, I think. And so I actually enjoy that process. So I do dislike playing the game and I dislike having to write the script, but usually the edit is something that I kind of enjoy. So that is a bit more relaxing.
Okay, so the actual production process itself is kind of simmering you down from the rage of
Yes.
a particularly poor PC game. Yeah, I do kind of, I'm sort of slightly concerned over this perception that Alex is like the Digital Foundry whipping boy. But there are disproportionately more poor PC ports than there are console games, so I guess that is a thing, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm just flashing back to the whole. I don't know if it was the Callisto Protocol, isn't it, where you reached rock bottom?
Yes, I reached rock bottom then. It'd been I think I just kind of like threw up my hands in that because it was just so glaringly obvious, and I've been talking about it already for more than a year and a half, I think at that point longer. And I was just like, what are they doing? And I kind of read some stuff about them like making a mistake or something like that.
Yeah, that was right. Yeah.
And, yeah, I don't know. I really couldn't believe that quote. It seemed to like just like absolute gaslight the user. So yeah, I don't like that. Actually, that's probably one thing that even after a game comes out and has problems, etc. But if they like write stuff online, like make sure your drivers are up to date and make sure your PC's plugged in and stuff like that. That's what I get really.
Yeah, From Software, the classic purveyors of the of the some users might have issues. And it's like, well, no, all users will have issues because it's a problem with the game. Some users might not notice the issue.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's still the classic From Software thing on console where they seem to think that resetting the cache, restoring the licenses could actually improve performance. But the funny thing is, of course, that the whole nature of that is that some people do think it does make a difference, and then it sort of propagates online, and it sort of doesn't really make sense whatsoever. Kind of crazy stuff. Okay, well, that is the end of that particular question. Therefore, it is the end of the show. So if you enjoyed it, please do like, subscribe, share, ring bells for notifications and notional algorithmic boosts for us. DF Supporter Program, join us, get high quality video downloads of everything we do and everything we have done since late 2016, actually. Early access to the Direct, early access to a bunch of other stuff, actually, and a whole lot more. Our Discord is pretty awesome. But that's all from us on this one. Thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry, and chances are we'll see you next week.